This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. This is part 2 of our conversation that I had with the community during my last town hall. And we're breaking this into short little sections, folks, so you can hopefully have more time to watch it, so it's not so long and drawn out. So with that in mind, let's get to it. In the first part, I mentioned that I had gone to leadership and counterterrorism training in Scotland this year in May. And that is very high level training. Very few people get to go to it. And you might ask, why did a sheriff from Eastern Washington end up getting invited by the FBI to go to this training? Well, it's because of my education and my experience with my research into domestic terrorism and international terrorism. It's because I've been heavily involved in this for a very long time, and they recognized my expertise in it, and it's because of my partnerships with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and leadership over the years of that task force and the work that we've done in this area that has disrupted domestic terrorism and international terrorism in our local area. That's why. So there, we talked about threats that the world faces. And we'll cover some of those in later sections. But I wanted to start this with the next slide, which is future issues of concern. If you remember in the first video, I had, the past always influences the future, especially when we refuse to learn from it. Well, the next section we're going to talk about is just that issue. That issue is, next slide, race. The race issue in America. The race issue in America, quite frankly, is tearing us apart. We refuse to learn from our past. Sometimes we won't recognize the past. But as I said in the first video, if we keep living in the past, we will never see a future. Yes, as a nation, we started with an institution of slavery, but that institution of slavery, rather than what's being portrayed, especially to young people, wasn't nationwide. We forget that. Many of our founding fathers wanted to do away with slavery, but they realized that that issue could have broken the newly formed country apart. So the North abolished slavery. The South maintained slavery. And we have had that divide in our nation basically ever since. Hotly discussed topic. The founding fathers realized they couldn't resolve that issue. They couldn't resolve the issues at the risk of losing the entire country that they had just fought to form. So they said they were going to leave it to future generations. And future generations, black and white, stood shoulder to shoulder and ended slavery. That time was called a Civil War. It took exactly what the founding fathers feared to end slavery, the Civil War. And black and white fought side by side to end slavery. Then we had 100 years of Jim Crow, especially in the South. And in the 1960s, black and white stood shoulder to shoulder once again during the Civil Rights Movement and ended Jim Crow. And we had some turbulent times during that time. We had race riots. We had mistrust between police and African Americans. We had mistrust between whites and blacks. We had police officers being ambushed and killed. Sound familiar? We don't learn from the past. We're reliving the late 60s, early 70s, ladies and gentlemen. We don't learn from the past. So what caused all this? Where did all this start? Well, let's start with this slide. 10 years of racial tension and hate. Basically, February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin was involved in a shooting, and he was killed by a vigilante-style individual, and that was the birth of Black Lives Matter. The individual that shot Trayvon Martin was tried, found innocent. DOJ looked into it because President Obama made sure that that happened. DOJ said there's nothing to file charges on here. President Obama's DOJ said that, folks. But Black Lives Matter couldn't handle that. Couldn't handle that. The fact that the evidence stated that the individual who shot Trayvon Martin did so in self-defense. Then we have July 17, 2014. Eric Gardner. And Eric Gardner was arrested during the struggle. They claimed that a chokehold was put on Mr. Gardner, and the claim was he died from the chokehold. Again, the officers faced all the scrutiny there was, a grand jury and everything else, a DOJ investigation. DOJ investigation found that there was no criminal actions by the officer, and more importantly, even though there's some conflicting autopsy information, because one doctor says something, another doctor says another thing. Bottom line, Eric Gardner dies of a heart attack, not a chokehold. I've watched the video. Eric Gardner starts struggling with the officer. Eric Gardner is a very large man, 6'2", 400 pounds. The officer tries to take him down. In the midst of that struggle, his arm does come in the neck area. When they hit the ground, it lasts a total of 7 seconds. And folks, having been trained in a lateral vascular neck restraint, because that's the proper terminology for what the activist media like to call a chokehold, there was no indications that he was trying to put that maneuver on. His arm was simply in the area of his neck. You actually see an officer in that video swipe his arm down away from the neck to ensure that there was no obstruction of the airway. Eric Gardner was still talking during that time that the arm was there. Eric Gardner started saying, "I can't breathe." And what we have come to find through very many tragic situations is that the words, "I can't breathe," are an indication of severe medical failure. The body's starting to shut down. So law enforcement, if you're listening, anytime you hear those words, you have a medical emergency on your hands. Odds are they're having a heart attack. Odds are they're going into some kind of shutdown of their respiratory pulmonary system, either because of underlying medical conditions, drugs or alcohol on board. You hear those words, you have a problem. So that's Eric Gardner. Next one. You have Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. We'll cover Michael Brown here in a minute. Then in April of 2015, you have Freddie Gray. None of the officers in Freddie Gray were ever convicted. As a matter of fact, They sued the state for malicious prosecution. And they got, they didn't win that, but all of them were found not to have caused any damage to Freddie Gray. But we had major protests and major riots in that event. Then we have Alton Sterling from Baton Rouge and Philandro Castile from Falcon Heights, Minnesota, on July 5th and 6th of 2016. Each one of those went through high scrutiny, and the officers were all cleared of wrongdoing. Both were armed. And that's one of the things that doesn't seem to ever make the papers or anything else, or the facts behind these. Next. Next slide. On July 7th, 2016, President Obama, speaking from Warsaw, talks about the Alton and Castile shootings, and at that point, nobody knew anything about them. No one knew the facts. All they knew was the hype. No one knew the facts. But we have a president of the United States talking about these two shootings and saying that the officers were already wrong. The vice president, Mr. Biden, makes this tweet. Again, no one knows what had happened at that point. I watched President Obama's press conference. I was actually on vacation. I was watching it. When it was done, I looked at my wife and went, things only get worse from here. Because we already had building tension. And then the next slide happens. Hours after that press conference, 5 Dallas police officers are killed in retaliation for the two shootings I just mentioned by a member of Black Lives Matter, and even though they say not a new Black Panther, he was there talking with them, so it's hard for me to believe that no affiliation. But he was a member of Black Lives Matter. 7 days later, 3 more police officers in Baton Rouge are killed under the same circumstances, radicalized hate. They were shot because they wore a uniform and they were white. The next slide. Much controversy about Mr. Kaepernick, but in August of 2016, nearly a month from when 8 police officers were killed because of radicalized hate, he wears socks depicting pigs wearing police uniforms. Then he ratchets it up and kneels for the national anthem. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one reason I have not watched the Super Bowl since that day. Because we failed to recognize that we as a nation jump to the conclusions often about what's going on. And activists and activist media have fed us misinformation about many of these cases. Why do I know so much about it? Because I've had to read it. I've read all the DOJ reports. I've read the evidence. Here's a secret to stopping officer-involved shootings. Don't pull guns on police officers. Don't fight with police officers. Don't try to take their guns away from them during those fights. Simply do as you're asked. If the police officer is wrong, file a complaint on them. But do not fight with the police officers. Do not pull guns on police officers. And if a police officer says, please do not reach for your gun because you're wearing one, please don't reach for the gun. Don't make us decide what your intent is. Please do not do that. Next slide. May of 2020, George Floyd. All of law enforcement gets painted with the same brush because of something that happened, again, in our perspective, 1,500 miles away. What happened to Mr. Floyd was bad. There's no getting away from that. But ladies and gentlemen, that was not racially motivated whatsoever. That was really stupidity. You actually listen to those videos, because I have. I've actually looked at the timelines. That contact was textbook perfect up until Mr. Floyd has to be put on the ground. They put him on the ground, and where it falls apart is when Chauvin puts his knee on his neck and holds him down. As Mr. Floyd was saying, "I cannot breathe." The rookie in that situation went, should we roll him up on his side? That is proper training. If you can't breathe, roll up on side, try to get the airway open. Chauvin didn't listen. It's not race, it was stupidity. But all of law enforcement and the entire criminal justice system was suddenly racist, systemically racist, and this nation continued to tear itself apart. What's the results of some of this on the law enforcement side? Now, go back to that slide. Well, in 21, 73 police officers were killed, many of them assassinated. 316 of them were shot. They say it was the deadliest year for us since 2016. Or let me rephrase that. Since 9/11, 2001, 9/11. Deadliest year. Well, not really. And the reason I say not really, go back to what I started talking about with the race tensions in the late 60s, early 70s. 72, 73, same situations went on. Black Panthers killed many police officers. You have to go back to 1973 to find that type of carnage that happened in our policing. And had the police officers of today not had their ballistic vests, not had the medical technology of today, you would have seen a much higher death toll. It would have rivaled that of the 70s. That's a harsh reality. Next slide. And it continues to this day. Just recently, police officer in Chicago ambushed. If you've never seen it, Dan Abrams, Police Under Fire. It's a really interesting perspective. Dan Abrams is affiliated with, I believe, ABC. So this is not a right-wing conspiracy type of individual. I try to keep my sources as neutral as possible. But if you haven't seen it, you need to watch this because he's spot on. Oh, there might be a little bit of people going, wait a minute, isn't he the guy from Live PD? Yeah, he put that program on. But if you know his history, he started out not so much a fan of law enforcement, but through the years has learned that the rhetoric that is being put out by activists and media about law enforcement, as in all we do is show up and kill people, is false. Next slide. I'm going to stop the presentation here, but we're going to talk next about this ruling. This is the most recent Washington Supreme Court ruling to come out, and it violates the United States Constitution, equal protection under the law clause. It violates every precedent there is, and it builds a two-tiered system of law enforcement in the United States. And I'm going to discuss the Sum decision in our next videos. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich. I hope you're finding this interesting. Have a good day.